technology changes who we are, the nature of our relationships, how we think about ourselves, how we think about other people, and quite literally, what we can see and what we can understand. Sometimes I say that technology is the architect of our intimacies, and it's this deeper, subjective side to technology that I'm going to be speaking about today, and of course, specifically, how it plays out in medicine. Because medicine is a field where this subjective side of technology, these subjective effects of technology, are profound, deeply felt both by patients and by medical professionals. So deeply felt, I'm going to argue, that sometimes everybody wants to forget them. That's how you know how deeply felt they are. Sometimes we tell ourselves that technological changes are inevitable, so inevitable, along with the cognitive and emotional side effects, good and bad, that come with them, that we can't do anything about them. This is the sort of horses out of the barn argument that you've all heard. So I'm going to be arguing today that it's time to reverse, when necessary, this argument about inevitability and technological determinism. And I want you to take this talk as a moment to start a new kind of conversation, not about technological determinism, but about your human values, and making sure that your human values are what are being played out in your practice of medicine. Because every powerful technology leads us to revisit our fundamental assumptions about what is most important about being human, which is a good thing, because that means that every technology causes us to confront what our human values really are. And I'm going to talk about three large areas where technology is making a difference about where we need to reassert our human values. The first area is in what I call the flight from conversation. New technology, particularly mobile technology, the kind of technology that's always on and always on you, gives all of us new ways to hide from emotionally difficult moments. Our personal lives are full of such moments. I study families that like to discuss their problems by text. They like to have family fights, not around the dining room table, but on GChat or by email. And they say that that makes it easier to express themselves because they can get heard out. There's a big premium on getting heard out and not interrupted, and that's what you can do if you talk on text or GChat instead of being around a dining room table. And of course, life and medicine are full of such moments. But what do we hide and what can't we say when we shift our conversations from being in person to moving them from screens to screens? And why do we want to do that? Why do we want to take our conversations and move them from the back and forth of presence to moving them to screens? Put most simply, face-to-face conversation makes us vulnerable. In face-to-face conversation, we really can be seen. One young man who likes to have all of his most important conversation by text and who's talking to me about why he likes family conversations online says to me, it's one of my favorite quotations in my fieldwork, he says to me, conversation, I'll tell you what's wrong with conversation. It takes place in real time and you can't control what you're going to say. It takes place in real time and you can't control what you're going to say. You could argue that that's everything that's wrong with conversation, and it's also everything that's right with conversation. And that's his story, and he's sticking to it. In other words, it makes you too vulnerable. But there's a cost to all this hiding. Face-to-face conversation, the kind that is spontaneous, the kind where you are vulnerable, is where empathy and intimacy are born. It's where relationships thrive. And recent research shows that college students have a 40% decline in all of the markers for empathy, in all of the ways that we know how with paper and pencil tests, which are imperfect to be sure, in all of the ways that we know how to measure empathy over a 30-year period. Since most of that change, since most of that decline in empathy took place in the last 10 years of the study, the researchers decided that that change really must have had to do with the advent of mobile technology, digital technology. People looking at their phones rather than each other. Now, from your point of view in medicine, the give and take of conversation, that empathic connection, is crucial. It's part of the healing relationship. You can't afford to lose it. You can't afford to lose it because a new record-keeping system encourages you to look at a screen rather than your patients. So a first issue is how technology can encourage us to settle for mere connection rather than rich conversation. It can also take us away, and this is the other side of the equation, it can take us away from conversation, but it can also take you away, and that's why this film is so wonderful, it can also take you away from solitude. It can also take you away from moments of solitude, of being able to think uninterrupted. So you have to worry about both of these things. It's taking you away from uninterrupted conversation. It's also taking you away from solitude of being able to think uninterrupted. Every one of you in this room contends with screens that distract you, not only from necessary conversations, but from necessary thinking. In cardiology, of course, these interruptions are a mixed blessing. Some of your distractions save lives. Patients now monitor themselves at home. That's a good thing. But physicians and other healthcare professionals are constantly pinged and pinged with messages about their state. Being available electronically all the time is disrupting care as well as enhancing it. So, in the future, we need to design systems with less interruption and more reflection, just as we need to design systems with less superficial connection and more conversation. Now, if this sounds unrealistic, and some of you are saying, well, that's unrealistic, I think it's because we have allowed technology to define the parameters of the possible. We have allowed technology to define the parameters of the possible. And this is typical of the early stages of adopting to technology. But we have to end up in a better place. We can't just say, oh, it's going to have to be this way. We just have to allow technology to define the parameters of the possible. So let me make an analogy. For the past 20 years, we have put up with extraordinary abuses of social media. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands if you think we've allowed for extraordinary abuses of social media, because I'll be too upset if I don't get enough hands. So I'm just going to say, we have allowed for extraordinary abuses of social media. And we all thought that that's how it had to be. But we see now And unfortunately, it has taken major abuses, but when the moment has come, we begin to see that when the moment and the will comes politically and as consumers, we can reshape technology. There are ways, ideas start to come forth, where we can reshape technology to conform to our human values. It's not going to be easy. It's not like there's a simple path that is opened up, but you can begin to see how that can happen. Because technology can make us forget what we know about life. Technology can make us forget what we know about life, personally, politically, professionally. Can you have intimacy without privacy? Can you have democracy without privacy? These are important questions. If privacy is a core value and we insist on it as consumers and citizens, we will get social media with privacy protections. Not perfect protections, but better. And we can almost see now how this can happen if we fight for it. So now let's think about medicine and what technology might be making us forget in this domain, in your domain. First of all, medicine is part, as I said, of this general flight from conversation, and it's part of the general flight from presence. But for physicians, spontaneity, presence, and real time is crucial to healing. You want your patient unfiltered. You want to hear the starts and the stops, the silences and the hesitations that can teach you so much about what you need to know. And you want the patient to hear you, human, actively listening and caring. Of course, email and chat and text and video have a place in modern medicine. Remote connection saves lives. But the danger is that when we are together, we start to use systems that keep us apart even when we are together. This is perhaps my most important point, that even when we are together, we use systems that keep us apart, even when we are together. It can be record-keeping systems that all but insist that the healthcare provider keep his or her eyes on the screen rather than on the patient. It can be going straight to ordering a test rather than taking the time for a medical history, a conversation, a thorough physical exam, or it can be an attitude. What the great novelist and medical writer and physician Abraham Verghese has called a preference for teaching the eye patient. I'm going to quote Verghese because he's just such a brilliant writer on this topic. Here's what Verghese says about the eye patient. The eye patient's blood counts and emanations are tracked and trended like a Dow Jones index, and pop-up flags remind caregivers to feed or bleed. Patients are handily discussed in the bunker, while the real patients keep the bed warm and ensure that the folders bearing their names stay alive on the computer. The problem with this chart as surrogate for the patient approach is that the map is not the territory. The map is not the territory. The simulation is not the real. In my interviews in hospitals and medical schools, because studying the eye patient and the eye patient's relationship to the patient is something that I've done, senior physicians have spoken to me with concern that young doctors come into medicine expecting that the answers to all problems will be found not so much in the examining room, but in diagnostic tests that the physician will see, and the phrase they all will use is later. Later. They tell me that young doctors believe so much in the scientific data they will get about the patient that they find it hard sometimes to focus on the patient. This belief in data that will come in later becomes a way to justify an only cursory conversation with the patient now. One 60-year-old faculty member at a major teaching hospital says to me, talking about the residents that he currently trains, and here's his quote: "They want to use tests to rationalize," and he's being very harsh, "they want to use tests to rationalize not talking to patients, because talking to patients is difficult and usually takes skills that young doctors don't have." Takes skills that young doctors don't have. In other words, he's sympathetic with these young doctors. Talking to these patients is tough because these young doctors don't have these skills yet, and they would rather just give the tests. And he's worried that he's not giving them enough support to learn those skills. In the new rely on the test culture, the standard physical exam can come to seem strangely intimate to young doctors. You touch the body, you investigate the past, you ask odd questions. Some of this touching and talking starts to seem unnecessary if you believe that the tests are going to tell you everything you need to know later. What I'm hearing from senior physicians is that their young colleagues become comfortable with being the kind of doctor who touches and talks less. Their skills for doing a physical exam degrade, and they need the tests even more. So you see this vicious circle kind of start to build up. The same senior physician who worried that his students are happy to avoid necessary conversations tells me this in sadness. Here's the quote from the senior physician that I interviewed. "My students don't want to take responsibility for the things that might come up in a conversation, things that would come out during a full patient history. They don't want to hear that their patients are anxious or depressed or frightened. Doctors used to want to hear those things. They knew that the whole person got sick. The whole person needed to be treated. Today, I worry that young physicians don't want to have that conversation. My students welcome the fact that the new medical record system almost forces them to turn away from the patient and keep the interchange about relevant details. They don't want to step into a more complicated role." This is Verghese's larger concern. It's not really about the technology. It's how the technology is speaking to our vulnerability. Our vulnerability, how technology is the architect of our intimacies, how technology is tutoring us to turn away from each other. Because there is a certain comfort in treating just the eye patient. In a certain way, it's easier, and we end up losing skills, precious human skills. And when this happens, we lose more than empathic connection with the human being in our care. We actually lose the ability to cure. Now, I am not anti-technology. I am pro-conversation. There's a difference. It is good to welcome new technology, but it is also important to put technology in its place. Technology is not doing us a favor if clinicians, in some sense, are becoming less comfortable with their patients' bodies. There is no point in preaching about the importance of a hands-on approach if doctors are no longer really taught, how to listen to heart sounds, because it's easier to just send for an echocardiogram. So, Verghese says, in summing up, for the clinician, the bedside is hallowed ground, the place where fellow human beings allow us the privilege of looking at, touching, and listening to their bodies. Our skills and discernment must be worthy of such trust. Now, these are serious problems, but medicine is a field that offers much hope. For one thing, it's a discipline, unlike many others, that is talking about its flight from conversation. The dangers of physicians looking at screens rather than patients, the over-reliance on tests, the need to return to the extended conversations of the traditional medical history, all of these are actively being discussed in your profession and widely discussed. And there is still an active generation of physicians committed to teaching medical students how to have rich conversations with patients. So this is not a sort of bad news story about a profession sort of in decline and sort of like there's no hope. I mean, I am actively in contact with people, physicians, medical schools, who are talking about this and working on this. This is a profession sort of in motion trying to address this. Second, medicine has responded to the pressures that cut off conversation with a spirit of invention. For example, there's a whole new profession of medical scribes that has grown up, designed to separate the doctor from the many screens that demand his time. These scribes are trained assistants who follow physicians around, filling in the reports required by insurance companies and really giving more time to the physician to do the work of a physician. The introduction of the scribes into medical practice illustrates how a profession can invent its way into necessary conversations. I think it's very impressive. We'll see where that goes. Another place in medical practice where technology is getting in the way is in the area of e-learning. A first concern is how technology encourages multitasking in learning. Indeed, technology does so much to make multitasking seem natural that it's been hard not to glorify multitasking and assume that it's a good thing. Now, you all know what multitasking is, and indeed, in my interviews, physicians are the profession most likely to insist that there is such a thing as learning how to multitask better, and that their jobs depend on learning how to do it skillfully. So across all the professions, physicians are the ones most likely to say, I know how to multitask, and being a good doctor means that I have to learn how to do it most skillfully, and I can even identify the doctors who can do it most skillfully. Bad news, the human brain does not multitask, it performs linearly, and you can't really get to multitask better. Repeated, close studies of multitasking show this. With every task you add to your multitasking, you do worse and worse at every task you add in the multitasking. Your performance deteriorates on every new added task. But the brain tricks you into thinking you're doing better and better at every new task you add. So this is a real challenge. Technology makes multitasking feel more and more natural, but it puts you in a vicious circle where we do worse and worse, even as we feel better and better about our performance. All educators, including medical educators, need to take note. You become addicted to this master of the universe feeling that multitasking gives you. You're on a multitasking high, even if you have enough sleep, even if you have all your wits about you, but multitasking itself deteriorates your work, but makes you feel that you're performing at your peak. The antidote here is to accept that your multitasking high is just that, a chemically induced illusion. Behave accordingly. Another issue in e-learning that I want to raise with you is particularly relevant to physicians is what I'll call just-in-time learning. This is the idea that you don't need to memorize things. You can look them up just when you need to know them. So, in humanities and social science classrooms, the argument goes something like this. Some say that students don't need to memorize facts, dates, timelines, because they can look them up on Google, say, on a need-to-know basis. They need big concepts, and I personally argue against this on a regular basis because it's not unusual to meet college students who don't know which came first, the First World War or the Civil War. Now, they have no embarrassment about this because they tell me I can always look it up on Google on a need-to-know basis. But let's think about this for a second. If you don't know that chronology, which came first, First World War or Civil War, you don't know a lot. You can't really think about the rise of industrial society right. You really can't think of the history of colonialism right. You can't really think about the role of the United States as a dominant world power in the first half of the 20th century right. There's just a bunch of things you can't think right that have to do with context. So that's what the story is in history and social science. But what about medicine, where there are so many apps to look things up right on the job? There's no lack of physician educators who argue that just-in-time knowledge, what some call e-memory, is the medicine of the future. So how does e-memory work on the job? You're in the hospital, you type in systems, and your digital tool recommends a potential diagnosis, a suggested course of treatment. 89% of medical residents regard one of these e-memory tools as their first choice for answering clinical questions. But will this just-in-time and just enough information teach young doctors to organize their own ideas and draw their own conclusions? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. E-memory will just get you by. It usually does until it doesn't. Just enough and just in time will never really be enough to build an independently thinking clinician able to solve tough problems. We can be fans of what e-memory provides, but not smitten. When we depend on e-memory, we lose that wide, unfiltered array of information that creates the conditions that we need for creativity and for serendipity. We know this, but technology, again, makes us forget what we know about life. And one of the things it does is present an image of efficiency that suggests that the friction-free technical world can be a model for all domains. And in that friction-free world, e-search is smoother than all those facts that we don't necessarily need to know. So in my view, what do we need to stand up for in medicine and medical education? We need to stand up for the importance of presence. We need to stand up for the importance of our physicality, of giving full attention, not the myth of multitask attention to what we are doing. We need to stand up for the gift, the human gift of empathy, of listening, of learning things by heart. We need to stand up for the gift of knowing each other's history, not just taking in each other bit by bit, symptom by symptom. And we need to stand up for the necessity of in-person mentoring. I want to end with a story, a personal story, about how we're all tempted by models of education done more and more online. My own institution, MIT, pioneered online education. I remember the meeting where we decided we would have graduate students meet students online, conferences take place online all the time. The graduate students would be available. There'd be no trekking across campus to meet a graduate student. Everything would be done on the computer. But I'll have to say this, that one of the bits of fallout of my very pro, talk to me, see me attitude in class is that my students always show up to class. I have like 100% attendance. That goes very well. They understand that I care very deeply about, I teach my class in person, you know, they're there, but they don't want to come to office hours. And this is part of a nationwide trend. I'm not alone, I don't take it personally. They don't want to come to office hours. And I ask them why. I tell them I'm famous. I tell them that people pay to talk to me. It doesn't work. So I ask them, what do they want instead? And they know what they want. They want to email me or text me a perfect question. And they want me to send them back the perfect answer. Perfect question, a myth that they can be perfect if they do it online, and I will send them back a perfect answer. They want to turn a relational encounter into a transactional encounter. So anyone who's been lit up by ideas, and that's everyone in the room, knows that it's not because you presented someone with a perfect idea, but much more likely because you presented an imperfect idea and a teacher or a coach or a professor said, come back again, let's get together, let's look at this again together. Again together, again together. The magic words for mentorship is crucial to teaching, and this mentorship is, of course, crucial to teaching in mentorship. You know, it's tempting to think that we can solve our problems with technology, that the problems that technology brought us will somehow be able to be solved with technology. But I leave you with this. It's we, people, actively listening, talking together. It's we who will solve the empathy gap. It's conversation that is the talking cure. Thank you very much.